The rain hadn't stopped for 3 days, and Elsie Marlowe was starting to think it never would. She was walking the back road that cut through Ashdown Forest, the shortcut she always took when she was late for her shift at the Whitmore estate, her boots sinking into mud that had gone soft and treacherous from the endless downpour. Her shawl was soaked through, doing nothing against the cold anymore, and she'd stopped bothering to pull it tighter around her shoulders somewhere around the 2nd mile. She almost didn't see him. He was slumped against the base of an old oak tree, half hidden by undergrowth, and if it hadn't been for the strange stillness of him too still, unnaturally still, she might have walked right past, mistaking him for a fallen branch or a heap of dark cloth someone had discarded. But something made her stop. Elsie crept closer, heart hammering, half convinced she was about to find a dead body, and half convinced her mind was playing tricks on her after too many exhausting weeks of scrubbing floors and hauling water for a household that barely acknowledged her existence. When she got close enough to see properly, she froze. It was a man. Or something shaped like one, anyway. His skin was pale, in a way that didn't look natural, even accounting for blood loss bone white, almost luminous even under the gray rain-soaked sky. His hair was black and soaked flat against his forehead, and there was blood, a lot of it, spreading dark through his torn shirt, pooling into the mud beneath him. "Oh God," Elsie whispered, dropping to her knees beside him without thinking, the mud soaking straight through her skirts. "Sir? Can you hear me?" His eyes opened slowly, and that was the second thing that made her breath catch. Because his eyes weren't right, either not human right. Anyway, a deep unnatural red, like something out of the ghost stories her grandmother used to tell to keep children from wandering into the woods at night. "Leave," he rasped, barely a whisper, blood at the corner of his mouth. "Not safe." "You're bleeding," Elsie said, which felt like an absurd thing to point out given how obvious it was, but her mind had gone strangely blank with panic. "I need to get help. There's a house not far now," he said, more forcefully this time, though it clearly cost him something, his hand weakly gripping her wrist to stop her from moving. "No one else. Not safe. For you." Elsie stared at him, at the wound in his side that looked far too severe for a man to still be conscious, let alone speaking. She'd tended enough injuries in her years working as a maid, cuts from kitchen accidents, burns from careless cooks, the occasional broken bone from a fall, but she'd never seen anything like this. The blood wasn't behaving right. It moved too slowly, like it was thick and unwilling to leave his body, and there was a strange cold radiating off him that had nothing to do with the rain. "What are you?" she asked, before she could stop herself, though some part of her already suspected the answer, buried deep in old superstitions she'd never quite let go of despite growing up. "Doesn't matter," he managed. "Please, go." But Elsie didn't go. She'd never been particularly good at walking away from something suffering. Not since she was a child bandaging injured birds that had fallen from nests, much to her mother's exasperation. She tore a strip from her already ruined skirt and pressed it hard against his wound, ignoring his weak protest, ignoring the cold that seeped from his skin into her hands. "I don't know what you are," she said, voice shaking but steady enough to be heard clearly over the rain. "But you're bleeding, and I'm not just going to leave you here to die in the mud like some abandoned animal." He made a sound that might have been a laugh, if he'd had the strength for one. "Foolish girl." "Probably," Elsie agreed. "Now hold still." She didn't know what made her do what she did next. Later, thinking back on it, she'd wonder if it was instinct or memory of some old story her grandmother used to tell, or simple desperation because nothing else she tried seemed to be working. But as she pressed her hands harder against his wound, feeling the blood soak warm and thick through the fabric, she found herself murmuring something under her breath, words she barely remembered learning. An old rhyme her grandmother used to whisper over sick children when the local doctor's medicine failed. Blood and bone, hold and mend, let this wound come to its end. It was nonsense. Probably just an old superstition, the kind her grandmother swore by and Elsie had always half believed out of love rather than conviction. But the stranger's whole body went rigid beneath her hands. The wound beneath the makeshift bandage seemed to shudder, and when Elsie pulled the fabric back to check, her breath caught entirely. The bleeding had stopped. Not slowed. Stopped. Completely. Elsie stared at the wound, at the torn flesh that moments ago had been pumping blood steadily into the mud, now closing at the edges like something invisible was stitching it shut from the inside. The stranger gasped, his back arching slightly, red eyes wide with something that looked like genuine shock. "What did you just do?" he said, voice suddenly stronger, though still ragged with pain. "I don't know," Elsie admitted, staring at her own hands like they belonged to someone else. "It's just something my grandmother used to say. It's not supposed to actually." She didn't finish the sentence, because the wound had closed entirely now, leaving only a thin, pale scar and smears of blood that were already starting to look old rather than fresh. The stranger pushed himself up slowly, testing his own body like he didn't quite trust it yet, flexing fingers that had been limp moments before. "That shouldn't be possible," he said, more to himself than to her. "Not from a mortal. Not without training, without knowledge of what you're actually doing. I told you, it's just something my grandmother said over sick children," Elsie said, though her voice had gone uncertain now, watching him move with an ease that seemed impossible given how close to death he'd looked only minutes before. "I didn't think it actually did anything." He looked at her properly then, red eyes narrowing slightly, studying her face like he was trying to solve some puzzle she wasn't aware she was part of. "What's your name?" "Elsie," she said. "Elsie Marlowe." "Elsie Marlowe," he repeated slowly, like testing the shape of it. "I am called Adrian." "Adrian Voss, are you going to tell me what you are?" Elsie asked, because there seemed little point pretending she hadn't noticed the eyes, the unnatural pallor, the blood that had stopped behaving like ordinary blood should. "Or are we just going to keep pretending I didn't just watch your wound heal itself in about 10 seconds? Something that might have been amusement flickered across his face, quickly buried beneath what looked like genuine wariness. "You're either very brave or very foolish, asking that question so plainly." "Probably both," Elsie admitted. "I've been told that before." "I'm a vampire," Adrian said, watching her carefully for her reaction, like he expected her to scream, or run, or faint dead away right there in the mud. "The last of my line, if the men who attacked me tonight get their way." Elsie absorbed that slowly, sitting back on her heels in the mud, rain still falling steadily around them both. She should have been terrified. Every superstition she'd grown up with told her she should be running for the nearest church, the nearest priest, anything to protect herself from whatever creature sat in front of her. But mostly what she felt was a strange, exhausted curiosity, the kind that came from working too many hours for too little pay and having very little energy left over for proper fear. "Who attacked you?" "Hunters," Adrian said grimly. "My family has enemies who have wanted us dead for generations. Tonight, they very nearly succeeded, but I stopped it," Elsie said slowly, still not quite believing it herself. "With a nursery rhyme." "Not just a nursery rhyme," Adrian said, something careful entering his voice. "That was old blood magic, Elsie. The kind that's been lost for centuries, the kind my own healers have spent lifetimes trying to relearn without success. Where did your grandmother learn something like that?" "I don't know," Elsie said honestly. She never said. She just always seemed to know things other people didn't. The village used to call her a witch, though never to her face. Adrian studied her for a long moment, something unreadable passing behind his red eyes. "Your grandmother may have been more than village gossip gave her credit for," he said finally. And you, Elsie Marlowe, may have just done something considerably more significant than you realize. Elsie looked down at her own hands again, blood-stained and shaking slightly from cold and shock both. I just wanted to help, she said. I didn't think it would actually work. Most miracles happen that way, Adrian said quietly. The person performing them rarely believes it's possible until it already has. He insisted on walking her the rest of the way to the Whitmore estate, despite her protests that he should rest after what he'd just survived. Elsie gave up arguing somewhere around the third refusal, mostly because arguing with a vampire while soaked to the bone in the middle of a forest felt like a battle she wasn't equipped to win. You said hunters attacked you, she said, as they walked together through the muddy path, rain finally beginning to ease into a light drizzle. Are they still out there? Likely, Adrian said. They don't tend to stop after one failed attempt. That's reassuring, Elsie muttered. I didn't say it to reassure you, Adrian said, and there was something almost like dry humor underneath the words, the first hint of anything lighter since she'd found him bleeding against that tree. I said it because it's true, and you deserve to know exactly what you've involved yourself in by helping me tonight. I didn't involve myself in anything, Elsie said. I found an injured man in the woods and did what any decent person would do. Most decent people would have run, Adrian said. Especially once they realized what I was. Most decent people probably haven't spent their whole lives being looked down on by people who think they're better, Elsie said. More sharply than she intended, years of quiet resentment slipping out before she could stop it. I know what it's like to be judged for things I can't help. I wasn't about to do the same thing to you. Adrian went quiet at that, glancing at her with an expression she couldn't quite read in the dim moonlight breaking through the clouds. The Whitmores don't treat you well, I take it. They treat me the way most households treat maids, Elsie said, shrugging despite the exhaustion sitting heavy in her shoulders. Invisible until something's needed, blamed the moment something goes wrong. It's not a complaint, exactly, just how things are. It should be a complaint, Adrian said, something sharp entering his voice. Being treated as though your existence only matters in service to someone else's comfort is not simply how things are, Elsie. It's how cruel people justify convenience. Elsie glanced at him, surprised by the sudden intensity in his voice. You sound like you have some experience with that. 600 years of watching mortals treat each other as disposable teaches you to recognize the pattern quickly, Adrian said. Whether the cruelty comes from a stepfather auctioning off a stepdaughter for sport, or a household treating a hardworking maid as invisible furniture. They reached the edge of the Whitmore estate grounds as the first gray light of dawn started creeping over the horizon, the rain finally tapering into nothing more than a light mist. I should go, Elsie said, glancing nervously toward the servants' entrance. If anyone sees me coming back at this hour looking like this, there'll be questions I don't have good answers for. Then, let me make this quick, Adrian said, reaching into his coat and producing a small velvet pouch that Elsie recognized immediately as containing more coin than she'd ever held in her hands at once. For your help tonight. I don't want payment, Elsie said, pushing his hand back gently. I told you, I just wanted to help. Then let me at least ensure I can find you again, Adrian said, something almost vulnerable slipping through his otherwise composed expression. What you did tonight, Elsie, it wasn't ordinary. I need to understand it properly, and I suspect there's more to your grandmother's knowledge than either of us currently realizes. Elsie hesitated, torn between the exhaustion pulling her toward her narrow servant's bed and the strange pull of curiosity that had gotten her into this whole situation in the first place. I work here most days, she said finally. There's an old well at the edge of the eastern garden, past the hedge line. I go there sometimes on my breaks, when I can steal a few minutes to myself. Then I'll find you there, Adrian said. If you're willing. I suppose I am, Elsie said, surprising herself with how easily the words came. Seeing as I've apparently already saved your life once, might as well see how the rest of this goes. She didn't tell anyone what had happened in the forest, obviously. Who would have believed her anyway, a maid claiming she'd stumbled across a bleeding vampire and healed him with an old nursery rhyme? She'd have been laughed out of the kitchen, or worse, accused of drinking, or dismissed entirely for the kind of nonsense that got servants let go without references. So she kept quiet, went about her work the way she always did, scrubbing floors and hauling laundry, and enduring Mrs. Whitmore's constant sharp comments about efficiency and gratitude servants ought to show for steady employment. But every few days, in the stolen minutes she managed near the old well at the edge of the eastern garden, Adrian was there. He never stayed long, careful about the risk of being seen, but their conversations stretched longer each time, filling in details neither of them had expected to share so freely. My grandmother died when I was 14, Elsie told him, one gray afternoon, sitting on the edge of the old stone well while Adrian stood nearby in the shade of an overgrown hedge, careful as always to keep away from direct sunlight, even on cloudy days. She was the only person who ever made me feel like I mattered for more than the work I could do. What was she like? Sharp, Elsie said, smiling slightly at the memory. Sharp-tongued, sharp-eyed, never suffered fools gladly. The village called her strange, half out of fear and half out of respect, though nobody ever said either word to her face. She sounds like she'd have approved of you standing your ground in that forest, Adrian said. She'd have said I was reckless, Elsie admitted. Kneeling in the mud to help a stranger who could have easily killed me if he'd wanted to. I could never have hurt you, Adrian said, quiet and certain. Not that night. Not any night since. Elsie glanced at him, something warm settling in her chest despite her best efforts to stay guarded. You barely knew me that night. I knew enough, Adrian said. I knew you stopped when every instinct should have told you to run. That's rarer than you'd think, Elsie. Rarer than 600 years of experience would suggest is common among mortals. Their conversations continued like that over the following weeks. Careful and quiet, stolen minutes stretching into stolen hours, whenever Elsie could manage the time away from her duties. She learned about his family's long history, about the hunters who'd sworn generations ago to wipe out his bloodline entirely, about the isolation of centuries spent watching everyone he ever cared about eventually grow old and die while he remained unchanged. He learned about her exhausting daily routine, about the quiet resentments she carried from years of being treated as beneath notice, about the dreams she'd quietly buried of doing something more with her life than scrubbing another family's floors. What would you do? Adrian asked one evening, the two of them sitting close together near the well as the sun set behind the hedges, if you weren't tied to this position. If you had the freedom to choose anything. Elsie considered the question seriously, something she hadn't allowed herself to do properly in years. I'd want to understand what my grandmother knew, she said finally. The healing, the old rhymes, whatever knowledge she carried that I only got fragments of before she died. I think there's more to it than either of us realized that night in the forest. I think you're right, Adrian said, and I think, if you're willing, I might be able to help you find out. The hunters found them 3 weeks later. Elsie had just finished her evening duties, slipping away toward the well for what had become a familiar routine, when she heard raised voices near the hedge line, sharp, urgent, unmistakably hostile. She rounded the corner just in time to see 3 men surrounding Adrian, weapons drawn, silver blades glinting even in the dim evening light. Adrian stood with his back against the old stone well, red eyes flashing dangerously, clearly outnumbered despite his supernatural strength. Stay back, one of the hunters barked, noticing Elsie's approach. This doesn't concern you, girl. He's done nothing wrong, Elsie said, stepping forward despite every instinct screaming at her to run. He's a monster that's evaded us for 3 weeks since our last attempt, the hunter snapped. That's more than enough concern for any decent person. Adrian's eyes met Elsie's briefly, something like desperate warning passing between them. Elsie, go. Now. This isn't your fight. But Elsie had never been particularly good at walking away from someone in trouble. Not since she was a child with injured birds, and definitely not now, watching 3 armed men close in on someone who'd shown her more genuine kindness in 3 weeks than most people had in her entire life. Wait, she said, voice shaking but steady enough to carry. Before you do whatever it is you're planning, at least hear me out. We don't negotiate with those who protect monsters, the lead hunter said coldly. Then at least explain why you're so certain he's a monster, Elsie pressed. Has he hurt anyone? Attacked anyone? Or are you just hunting him because of what he is, rather than anything he's actually done? The hunter hesitated, something flickering behind his eyes that might have been doubt, quickly buried beneath practiced conviction. His bloodline has caused suffering for generations. That's reason enough. His bloodline, Elsie repeated. Not him. You're punishing him for things his ancestors did, not anything he's chosen himself. It doesn't work that way, girl, the hunter said, though his sword arm had lowered slightly, uncertainty creeping into his stance. Adrian used the moment of hesitation, moving with sudden supernatural speed to disarm the nearest hunter, sending his silver blade skittering across the grass. The other 2 hunters lunged forward, and for a moment, chaos erupted, shouting, the clash of steel, Elsie scrambling backward out of the immediate danger while trying desperately to find some way to help. She remembered, suddenly, the words her grandmother used to whisper, not just over sick children, but sometimes, rarely, over wounds that needed more than healing protection. The old woman had called it, though she'd never fully explained what that meant. Shield of blood, shield of bone. Let no harm reach flesh not its own. She didn't know why she said it, didn't know if it would do anything at all. But as the words left her lips, something shifted in the air around Adrian, a faint shimmer that deflected the next hunter's blade just enough that it glanced harmlessly off what looked like empty air instead of finding its mark. The hunters froze, staring at the strange deflection with open shock. What was that? One of them demanded, backing away slightly. That, Adrian said, straightening from his defensive crouch, red eyes gleaming with something that looked almost like triumph, is considerably more than you bargained for tonight. The hunters exchanged uncertain glances, clearly recalculating their odds now that whatever protection Elsie had just conjured had entered the equation. After a tense moment, the lead hunter signaled a retreat, the 3 of them backing away into the darkness with promises of returning better prepared. Once they were gone, Adrian turned to Elsie, something urgent and searching in his expression. What did you just do? I don't know, Elsie admitted, staring at her own trembling hands. Another rhyme. I didn't even think about it. It just came out. Elsie. Adrian said slowly, I don't think your grandmother was simply a village healer with old superstitions. I think she was something considerably rarer, and I think that same rare gift may be alive in you. They didn't have much time to process what had happened before the practical reality set in the hunters would be back, better prepared, and neither Elsie nor Adrian could risk another confrontation happening so close to the Whitmore estate, where innocent people could easily get caught in the crossfire. You need to come with me, Adrian said, urgency clear in his voice as they hurried away from the well, putting distance between themselves and the estate grounds. At least until we understand what you're capable of, and until I can ensure the hunters don't come looking for you specifically, now that they've seen what you can do. I have a position here, Elsie said, though even as she said it, the words felt hollow given everything that had just happened. A job. People depend on me. The Whitmores would replace you within a week if you left, Adrian said, not unkindly, just honestly. You know that as well as I do. But if the hunters return and find you unprepared, without understanding your own abilities, you could be seriously hurt, or worse. Elsie knew he was right, even as every practical instinct screamed against abandoning the only stable position she'd managed to secure since her grandmother's death. But something about tonight, the fear, the strange power that had moved through her without her fully understanding it, the way Adrian had looked at her like she mattered more than any job title ever, could make the decision easier than it probably should have been. Where would we go? My estate, Adrian said. It's remote, well protected, and it has resources that might help us understand exactly what kind of gift your grandmother passed down to you. She gave her notice to Mrs. Whitmore the following morning, citing a family emergency that required her immediate departure, not entirely a lie, given how strange the whole situation had become. Mrs. Whitmore, predictably, seemed more annoyed at the inconvenience than concerned for Elsie's well-being, muttering about the difficulty of finding reliable help these days as Elsie packed her few belongings. The journey to Adrian's estate took most of the day, winding through increasingly remote countryside until the manor finally emerged from a dense tree-lined old gray stone, ivy-covered walls, tall narrow windows that seemed designed more to keep daylight out than let it in. It's not what I expected, Elsie admitted, staring up at the imposing structure. What did you expect? Something colder, maybe, Elsie said. You don't seem like the type to live somewhere without warmth. Adrian's expression softened slightly at that, something almost surprised crossing his features. Most people expect exactly that. Cold stone for a cold creature. You're not cold, Elsie said simply. Distant sometimes, maybe. Careful, but not cold. They spent the following days in Adrian's extensive library, poring over old texts about blood magic and protective wardings, ancient healing practices that had mostly faded from common knowledge over the centuries. Elsie discovered, gradually, that her grandmother's rhymes weren't simple superstition at all, but fragments of a much older tradition, one that had nearly died out entirely. Practiced by a small number of gifted individuals, capable of channeling protective and healing magic through carefully chosen words and genuine intention. It requires more than knowledge of the words themselves, Adrian explained, one evening as they sat together near the library's massive fireplace. It requires genuine intention, real care for the person you're trying to protect or heal. That's likely why your magic worked so powerfully with me, and why the hunters couldn't simply replicate it themselves, even if they somehow learned the words. That's a lot of pressure, Elsie said, only half joking. Meaning, I have to actually care about someone for the magic to work properly. I'd say that's less pressure and more reassurance, Adrian said, something warm in his voice that made her chest tighten slightly. It means the magic can't be weaponized carelessly. It requires genuine connection. Good thing I already care about you then, Elsie said, before she could think better of it, immediately feeling her face heat at how easily the admission had slipped out. Adrian looked at her for a long moment, something vulnerable breaking through his usually composed expression. Good thing indeed, he said quietly, because I find myself caring about you rather more than 600 years of careful solitude ever prepared me to expect. The hunters returned faster than either of them expected. It was barely 2 weeks later when the estate's perimeter alarms, ancient wards Adrian's family had maintained for generations, flared to life in the middle of the night, waking the entire household to the reality that the threat hadn't simply retreated in defeat. They've brought reinforcements, Adrian said grimly, watching from the tower window as torchlight flickered through the tree line surrounding the estate. More than the 3 from before. This won't be a simple skirmish. How many? Enough that I'm genuinely concerned, Adrian admitted, which from a 600-year-old vampire who'd survived countless conflicts was considerably more alarming than if he'd simply lied to spare her feelings. Elsie's stomach twisted with fear, but underneath it, something steadier was building, the same instinct that had made her kneel in the mud beside a bleeding stranger months ago. The same refusal to simply stand by while someone she cared about faced danger alone. Then, we prepare properly, she said. You said the magic requires genuine intention and care. I have plenty of both where you're concerned. Adrian looked at her with an expression caught somewhere between pride and fear for her safety. This isn't a small risk, Elsie. Hunters trained specifically to counter protective magic could easily overwhelm someone still learning to control her abilities. Then I suppose we'd better hope I learn quickly, Elsie said, steadier than she felt. They spent the remaining hours before dawn preparing as best they could, Adrian rallying what loyal household guards remained. Elsie practicing the protective wardings with an intensity born of genuine terror and genuine determination both. By the time the first hunters breached the outer grounds as dawn broke, Elsie had managed to reinforce the estate's ancient protective boundaries enough that the initial wave found themselves repelled by an invisible barrier none of their weapons could immediately breach. Impressive, the lead hunter called out, recognizing Elsie standing beside Adrian on the manor steps, her hands glowing faintly with the effort of maintaining the ward. But barriers weaken, eventually. Girl, everything does. Then we'll simply have to make sure yours breaks first, Elsie shot back, drawing on reserves of courage she didn't fully know she possessed. The battle that followed was chaotic, and terrifying hunters attempting repeatedly to breach the wards while Adrian's guards held the physical line. Elsie pouring every ounce of concentration into maintaining the protective barrier even as exhaustion began pulling at the edges of her control. She could feel Adrian's presence beside her throughout, a steadying anchor even as the strain of the magic threatened to overwhelm her entirely. It was nearly noon before the hunters finally began to retreat, recognizing that the combination of Adrian's supernatural strength and Elsie's unexpectedly powerful protective magic had turned what should have been an easy victory into an unwinnable siege. As the last of them disappeared back into the tree line, Elsie finally allowed the ward to drop, her legs giving out from sheer exhaustion the moment the immediate danger passed. Adrian caught her before she hit the ground, cradling her carefully as her vision swam from the effort she'd just expended. You did it, he said, something like awe in his voice. You held that ward for nearly 6 hours, Elsie. Do you understand how extraordinary that is? Feels less extraordinary and more like I might pass out, Elsie mumbled, only half joking. Rest, Adrian said gently, carrying her toward the manor despite her weak protests that she could walk perfectly well on her own. You've more than earned it. As exhaustion finally pulled her under, Elsie felt Adrian's cold lips press gently against her forehead, and heard him murmur something too quiet for her fading consciousness to fully catch something that sounded remarkably like gratitude, and something that sounded remarkably like the beginning of a promise. She woke hours later in an unfamiliar but comfortable bedroom, sunlight streaming through tall windows despite the earlier chaos, her body aching with the particular exhaustion that came from pushing magic further than she'd ever attempted before. Adrian was seated nearby, close enough that she suspected he hadn't left her side the entire time she'd been unconscious. You're awake, he said, relief evident in his voice despite his usually composed demeanor. I was beginning to worry. How long was I out? Nearly a full day, Adrian admitted. You pushed yourself far beyond anything reasonable to expect from someone still learning to control such power. Did it work, though? Are the hunters gone? For now, Adrian said carefully. They retreated, but I doubt permanently. Groups like that rarely accept defeat easily, especially after witnessing power like yours. Elsie sat up slowly, testing her strength, relieved to find the worst of the exhaustion had faded into simple tiredness rather than the bone-deep depletion she remembered from the battle itself. Then, we need a permanent solution, not just repelling them temporarily, but ending this properly. I've been thinking the same thing, Adrian said. There's an old ritual, one my family has known about but never dared attempt, that could potentially end the hunter's claim against my bloodline permanently. But it requires exactly the kind of gift you possess, Elsie. Blood magic strong enough to forge a lasting protective bond, not just a temporary ward. Tell me what it requires, Elsie said, without hesitation. It requires you understanding fully what you'd be agreeing to, Adrian said carefully. This isn't a simple spell, Elsie. It would bind your life force to the protective boundary permanently, extending your years considerably in exchange for maintaining the ward indefinitely. It's not something to agree to lightly. Elsie considered this seriously, thinking of her grandmother, of the years spent feeling invisible and disposable in service to people who barely acknowledged her existence, of the strange, powerful sense of purpose she'd felt maintaining that ward, despite the exhaustion threatening to overwhelm her. Would it mean staying here? With you? Yes, Adrian said, something vulnerable entering his voice. Permanently, if that's something you'd want. And if I don't do this, if we just keep fighting off attacks one at a time, then eventually, I fear, they'll succeed, Adrian admitted honestly. Numbers alone will overwhelm us eventually, no matter how skilled you become. Elsie looked at him for a long moment, weighing everything the life she'd left behind at the Whitmore estate. The quiet loneliness of scrubbing floors for people who never truly saw her, against this strange, dangerous, but genuinely meaningful existence she'd stumbled into since that rainy night in the forest. I want to do it, she said finally, not just because it's necessary. Because I choose this life, Adrian. Because for the first time since my grandmother died, I feel like what I do actually matters to someone. It matters to me, Adrian said quietly. More than you probably realize. Then let's finish this properly, Elsie said, steadier now than she'd felt since this whole strange journey began. Show me what the ritual requires. The ritual took place 3 nights later, once Elsie had fully recovered her strength and Adrian had prepared everything necessary in the estate's ancient ritual chamber, a circular stone room deep beneath the manor that had apparently been used for exactly this kind of purpose generations before either of them existed. Once we begin, there's no stopping partway through, Adrian warned, standing across from her in the candlelit chamber, ancient symbols carved into the stone floor beneath their feet. You need to be completely certain. I'm certain, Elsie said, and found she meant it entirely. The ritual itself was simpler than she expected, though the toll it took was immediate and significant, a shared cut across both their palms, blood mingling as Elsie spoke the old protective words her grandmother had taught her fragments of, feeling the power move through her differently this time, deeper, more permanent, binding itself not just to the immediate moment, but to something lasting. When it finished, both of them breathing hard from the effort, Elsie felt something settle into place inside her chest, not painful, just present, like discovering a heartbeat she hadn't known was missing until it finally synced properly with her own life. It's done, Adrian said, examining the faint mark, now visible on both their palms, mirror images of each other. The estate's protection is permanently bound now, Elsie, properly, completely. How do you feel? Different, Adrian admitted. Lighter, somehow, like a weight I've carried for centuries has finally found somewhere else to rest. Good, Elsie said, smiling despite her own exhaustion. Because I intend to keep carrying it alongside you for a very long time. The following months brought a kind of peace neither of them had fully expected the hunters, upon discovering their attempts to breach the newly reinforced wards were entirely futile, eventually abandoned their pursuit altogether, recognizing the permanent nature of what Elsie's magic had accomplished. Elsie found herself settling into estate life with a comfort that surprised her, given how foreign this world had seemed only months before. She spent her days studying the old texts in Adrian's library, gradually uncovering more of her grandmother's forgotten tradition, teaching herself protective and healing magic that had nearly vanished from common knowledge entirely. You're becoming quite skilled, Adrian observed one evening, watching her successfully complete a complex healing ward on an injured household guard who'd taken a bad fall from the stable loft. "I have a good teacher," Elsie said, though she suspected her natural affinity for the magic had far more to do with her grandmother's blood than anything Adrian had specifically taught her. "You have considerable natural talent," Adrian corrected. "I've simply provided the resources to help you understand it properly." Elsie smiled, setting aside her research for the evening, watching the sunset through the library's tall windows with a contentment she hadn't expected to find in a life so far removed from anything she'd previously imagined for herself. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked quietly. "Finding me that night in the forest, being tied to someone so ordinary compared to everything else you've experienced across 6 centuries? Adrian looked at her with an intensity that made her breath catch slightly. "Elsie, in 600 years, I have never once encountered anyone quite like you. Not ordinary. Extraordinary. In ways you still don't fully recognize yourself. Finding you bleeding my own blood into the mud that night was, without question, the single most fortunate accident of my very long existence." Winter arrived properly by the time Adrian finally worked up the courage to ask her the question that had apparently been sitting on his mind for weeks, judging by the careful way he approached the topic one quiet evening in the library. "I've been thinking," he began, uncharacteristically hesitant for a man who'd faced down armed hunters without flinching, "about what comes next for us. Properly, I mean. Beyond simply surviving the immediate threat. That sounds like the beginning of something important," Elsie said, setting aside the old text she'd been studying, giving him her full attention. "I've lived 600 years largely alone," Adrian continued. "Watching people I cared about grow old and pass, learning eventually to keep enough distance that the losses wouldn't destroy me entirely. I never expected to find someone whose presence made that distance feel unnecessary. Unwanted even, Adrian," Elsie said softly, recognizing the vulnerability in his voice. "I'm not explaining this well," he admitted, something almost boyish in his frustration despite his centuries of composed dignity. "What I'm trying to say, Elsie, is that I don't want to simply be bound to you through necessity, or magic, or protective obligation. I want to build something intentional with you. A life. Properly chosen, not just circumstances neither of us anticipated." Elsie felt her chest tighten with an emotion too large to easily name. "Are you asking me something specific, or just circling around it?" Adrian's mouth quirked slightly, some of his usual composure returning despite the vulnerability still evident underneath. "I suppose I'm asking if you'd consider making this permanent. Not just the magical binding we've already completed, but something more. Something chosen entirely for its own sake, rather than necessity." "You're asking me to marry you," Elsie said, something warm blooming in her chest despite how carefully she'd tried to keep her expectations modest. "I am," Adrian confirmed. "Though I confess I've had considerably more practice negotiating with hostile hunters than proposing marriage, so you'll have to forgive my clumsiness." Elsie laughed, the sound surprising her with how genuinely happy it felt after everything they'd survived together. "I think you managed just fine," she said. "Yes, Adrian. I'll marry you." They were wed the following spring, in a quiet ceremony held in the estate's gardens, rather than any grand cathedral, simple, intentional, witnessed only by Adrian's loyal household staff and the memory of a grandmother whose forgotten magic had brought them together in the first place. Elsie wore a dress she'd made herself, careful stitches reflecting the same patient skill her grandmother had once taught her, back when she was young enough to still believe in old rhymes and half-remembered magic without fully understanding their power. "The structure holds," Adrian murmured to her after the ceremony, echoing words she'd read once in an old family journal about protective magic that lasted only when built on genuine intention rather than desperate necessity. "It holds because we built it properly," Elsie replied, leaning into him, feeling the familiar warmth of their matched palm marks pressed together. Not out of fear, out of choice. There was a version of this story, she thought sometimes, where a poor maid simply walked past an injured stranger in the rain, too exhausted and too afraid to stop, where the old rhyme her grandmother taught her stayed forgotten, unused, buried under generations of forgotten tradition. But that wasn't the story that happened. Instead, an exhausted maid had knelt in the mud on a rainy night, had whispered words she barely remembered learning, and had discovered, in doing so, both an extraordinary gift she never knew she carried, and a love more enduring than either of them had dared to hope for across all their years. Mortal and immortal alike. Some evenings, long after the wedding, Elsie would find herself back at that same old well at the edge of what used to be the Whitmore estate, standing at the boundary between her old life and the one she'd chosen since. She never went inside anymore, never spoke to Mrs. Whitmore or any of the other servants who'd once barely acknowledged her existence. But something about visiting the old well felt important, a way of honoring the version of herself who'd once believed her only worth lay and scrubbing floors for people who never truly saw her. "You come here often," Adrian observed, one particular evening, having followed her without her quite noticing until he spoke. "I like remembering where I started," Elsie said. "It makes everything since feel more real somehow, like I haven't simply dreamed this whole life into existence." "You earned every part of it," Adrian said, coming to stand beside her near the old stone well. "Nothing about this was given freely, Elsie. You fought for it. Bled for it. Quite literally, more than once." "So did you," Elsie pointed out. 600 years of loneliness isn't exactly nothing either." "No," Adrian agreed. "But I think we've both discovered something worth all that struggle." Elsie's grandmother's old cottage still stood nearby, abandoned since her death years before, and sometimes Elsie would visit there too, sitting quietly among the dust and memories, feeling closer to the woman who'd passed down knowledge she'd never fully explained, but had clearly understood the value of, even if she'd never lived to see exactly how far that gift would carry her only granddaughter. "I wish she could have met you," Elsie said one evening, standing in the small cottage's main room, running her fingers along an old wooden table that still held faint carved initials from when Elsie was young enough to think leaving her mark on furniture was an act of rebellion rather than simple childhood mischief. "I wish that too," Adrian said quietly, though I suspect, in some sense, her legacy lives on regardless. Every time you use the magic she taught you, every time you protect someone the way she clearly taught you to value, some part of her continues on. Elsie smiled at that, something warm and settled replacing the old grief that used to accompany thoughts of her grandmother's death. "That's a kind way of looking at it. I've had considerable practice finding meaning in loss," Adrian said. 6 centuries provides ample opportunity to learn that lesson, whether or not I wanted to. They returned to the estate together as evening properly settled into night, the household staff greeting them with the easy familiarity that had developed over the past year. The protective wards Elsie maintained humming quietly at the boundaries, keeping watch over a home that had become genuinely theirs, rather than simply Adrian's ancestral property. Elsie still practiced her grandmother's old magic daily, gradually rebuilding a tradition that had nearly vanished entirely, teaching what she learned to a small number of household staff who showed natural aptitude, ensuring the knowledge wouldn't simply die with her the way it had nearly died with her grandmother. "You're building something remarkable," Adrian told her one evening, watching her patiently guide a young stable hand through his first successful minor healing ward. "Not just protecting what already exists, creating something new that will outlast even us. I learned that from someone who spent 600 years thinking his own legacy was simply survival," Elsie said, smiling at him. "Turns out, legacy can mean considerably more than that, if you're brave enough to build it properly." Years passed, though Elsie found herself aging more slowly than she'd expected, the ritual's binding apparently extending her years considerably, the way Adrian had warned it might, though not so dramatically that she felt disconnected from her own humanity, the way she sometimes worried it might. She remained recognizably herself, the same sharp, practical mind, the same stubborn refusal to walk away from someone in need, the same careful, patient hands that had once mended torn fabric and now mended wounds both physical and otherwise across the growing household Adrian's estate had slowly become. The hunters never returned, the permanent nature of the protective ward apparently convincing even the most stubborn among them that Adrian's bloodline had finally found protection too significant to overcome. Occasional rumors reached them of other vampire families facing similar threats, and more than once, Elsie found herself traveling with Adrian to offer whatever assistance her growing mastery of protective magic could provide, slowly building a reputation that extended well beyond the boundaries of their own estate. "You've become something of a legend yourself," Adrian told her, amusement evident in his voice, one evening after they'd returned from helping a distant vampire family secure their own estate against a similar hunter threat. The maid who healed a vampire king with nothing but an old nursery rhyme and refused to be frightened away by 6 centuries of supernatural danger. "I wasn't trying to become a legend," Elsie said, though she couldn't entirely suppress her smile. "I was just trying to help someone who was bleeding in the rain." "Most legends start exactly that simply," Adrian said. "It's rarely the grand gestures that create lasting impact, Elsie. It's the small, genuine choices to help when it would have been considerably easier not to." She thought about that often, in the years that followed, how one moment of stopping when she could have easily kept walking had reshaped not just her own life, but Adrian's, and eventually the lives of countless others who benefited from the protective magic she'd rediscovered and painstakingly rebuilt from her grandmother's fragmented teachings. The old well at the edge of the Whitmore estate eventually fell into disuse entirely, the estate itself changing hands more than once over the years as Elsie watched from a distance, her own life continuing steadily forward while the world she'd once been trapped in slowly moved on without her. She didn't feel nostalgic for that old life. Not really. She'd simply been surviving then, invisible and exhausted, never allowing herself to imagine anything beyond scrubbing floors for people who barely acknowledged her humanity. What she'd built since the magic, the marriage, the genuine purpose of protecting people who mattered to her, felt considerably more real than anything that exhausted, invisible existence had ever offered. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened?" she asked Adrian one quiet evening, the two of them sitting together in the library that had become genuinely home rather than simply his ancestral property. "If I'd walked past you that night? If I'd been too tired, or too frightened, to stop?" "I try not to dwell on it," Adrian admitted. "The hunters would likely have finished what they started. I would have died that night. 600 years of existence ended in the mud of a forest, largely unmourned by anyone beyond my immediate household." "That's a grim thought." "It is," Adrian agreed. "Which is precisely why I choose instead to focus on what actually happened." "You stopped. You knelt in that mud despite every reason not to. And in doing so, you gave both of us considerably more than either of us had any right to expect from a single rainy night's chance encounter." Elsie reached for his hand, feeling the familiar warmth of their matched palm marks pressed together, a permanent reminder of the choice they'd both made to build something lasting from what had started as pure chance. "I'm glad I stopped," she said simply. "So am I," Adrian said. "More than you'll likely ever fully understand." That evening, as the last light faded properly into night, Elsie found herself back in the small cottage that had once belonged to her grandmother, Adrian waiting patiently outside to give her the privacy she sometimes needed for these quiet visits. She lit a single candle, the same way her grandmother used to, and sat at the old wooden table where she'd learned her first fragments of the old protective magic, back when she was too young to understand its significance and old enough to feel the particular loneliness of losing the one person who'd ever made her feel truly valued. "I finished it," she said quietly. To the empty room, to the memory of a woman who'd passed down more than she'd ever fully explained. "Everything you started, everything you taught me in bits and pieces, I barely understood at the time. I finished it properly." She thought sometimes about the strange, winding path that had led her here from an exhausted maid, walking a muddy forest path in pouring rain, to a woman whose rediscovered magic protected an entire vampire estate, and, gradually, considerably more territory beyond it. She thought about her grandmother's quiet wisdom, dismissed by the village as simple superstition, revealed instead to be genuine, powerful knowledge, nearly lost to time. "I hope you'd be proud," she said softly, extinguishing the candle and stepping back out into the cool evening air where Adrian waited, exactly as steady and patient as he'd been every day since that first rainy encounter that had changed both their lives so completely. "Ready?" he asked, offering his hand. "Ready," Elsie confirmed, taking it, feeling the familiar warmth of their matched marks settle into place as they always did. They walked back toward the estate together, the protective wards humming quietly at the boundary, welcoming them home the way they always did, not because ancient magic demanded it, but because two people had chosen, deliberately and repeatedly, to build something worth protecting. Some stories began with grand declarations, with public spectacle and dramatic rescue. This one had begun quietly, with an exhausted maid kneeling in the mud beside a dying stranger, whispering words she barely remembered learning, expecting nothing beyond the simple satisfaction of having tried to help. It turned out to be considerably more than that. It turned out to be the beginning of an entirely new life, built not on desperate necessity or ancient obligation, but on the simple, steady choice to keep showing up for someone worth showing up for, evening after evening, year after year, for however many years an extraordinary gift and an equally extraordinary love might grant them both.